Hey, Rick Sammon here. Thank you so much for joining me for my online seminar, Master Landscape and Seascape Photography. As always, I hope you learn a lot and I hope you have a lot of fun. I love giving seminars, and everyone who comes to one of my seminars is a student for life. That means you can email me a question about photography for the rest of my life. Just shoot me an email at ricksalmon@me.com. I really do love giving seminars, and I want to thank you again for joining me. But as much as I love giving seminars, I love photographing. That's a picture of me photographing landscapes and seascapes up in Iceland, and I'm going to share with you in this seminar some of my favorite Iceland photographs. Now, after the seminar, you may want to go back and review some of the different topics. Well, if you go to my website, ricksalmon.com, and in the search window type in Master Landscape and Seascape Photography, you'll find a timeline, an exact timeline for the different topics in the class. So this is a very easy way for you to go back and review the different topics. During the class, I'm going to take you to my favorite locations around the planet for landscape and seascape photography. I have more than 200 slides illustrating different topics, but this is just not a slideshow of pretty pictures. For every picture I show, I'm going to share with you a tip, a trick, or technique. Well, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get started. Before we get into all the tech talk about f-stops and shutter speeds and depth of field and all that stuff, I'd like to talk about the most important thing when it comes to your photograph. It's the mood, it's the feeling that that photograph creates when you look at it and when someone else looks at that photograph. Look at this photograph taken up in Iceland in a glacial lagoon. It's the overcast dark sky that creates the mood in this photograph. It adds drama to the image. In this photograph, it's the reflection that creates that feeling, that mood of peace and tranquility. In this photograph, taken in Kenya at sunrise, it's the orange, overcast, dust-filled sky that creates the feeling of remoteness. And in this photograph, also taken in Kenya, it's that wide open sky that creates the sense of a wide open place. So remember, when you're looking through that viewfinder, yes, think technical, but always remember it's the mood. It's the feeling. That's the most important element when it comes to making your photograph. There's one more topic I'd like to talk about before we get going with all that tech talk. So, I want to ask you a question. Where and why do you point your camera? Now, you may never have thought of this, but it's an important question, and the answer may lie in the different types of images we take. Now, there are many different types of images. We're going to cover just a few. There are zoomorphic images. Now, these are images in which we see the shape of an animal. Now, I'm down in Antarctica. I'm cruising around in a zodiac. Does this look like a polar bear? On its back with the eyes and the ears and the mouth and the paws and the knee and the foot up in the air? It's a zoomorphic image. This is why I made this photograph. This is what's called an anthropomorphic image. These are images in which we see the shape of a man. Again, I'm cruising around in a zodiac in Antarctica, and I see the profile of a man in the scene. So this is why I took this photograph. So photographing familiar objects is a reason we make pictures. However, Minor White, a very famous black and white photographer, would take his students to this place on the Oregon coast, and he would try to help his students develop what's called pristine vision, where you photograph things you don't recognize. I've tried to do this. It's not that easy. Let me give you a couple of examples. My wife Susan and I are walking around the wall. She calls me over and says, "Hey Rick, look at this pattern in the rocks. This looks just like a wave." This is what's called an isomorphic image. These are images in which we see and photograph a recognizable shape. Again, this looks like a wave. I'm walking around the wall trying to develop this pristine vision, and I come across this. This looks like a heart to me, complete with the valves. This is why I took this picture. Edward Weston, another famous photographer, was also into that pristine vision. So he would take his students to a place on the California coast called Weston's Beach. So I get there and I'm looking around the scene. This is a boring picture, but up on the left I see that rock formation over there. Again, it looked like an animal. It looked like the eye in there. So I go up close and I saw a wild animal or a beast in this picture. So we really do photograph what we recognize, which is kind of cool here, but try to develop that pristine vision. I'm out in Escalante National Monument in Utah, trying to develop this pristine vision and encourage my students to do this. I'm teaching HDR and I'm teaching how to create the starburst effect by shooting at f/22 with a wide-angle lens, by the way. So we accomplished that goal. But then I'm showing this picture in a slide presentation, and someone says, hey, that looks just like the profile of George Washington. So I'm trying to develop that pristine vision, and someone sees George Washington in this photograph. Kind of cool. I'm out in Red Rock Canyon. This is a place called Elephant Rock. Looks pretty much like an elephant. So my friends, ask yourself, very important question, where and why do you point your camera? It'll give you an understanding of why you make photographs. Let's go over some basic image concepts, starting with getting everything in the scene in focus. When I take a landscape or seascape photograph, I want the scene to look as it looks to my eyes. Everything in the scene in focus. So you can see here, that's right, everything's in focus. Same thing in this photograph. So for maximum depth of field, you want to use a wide-angle lens, the wider the better. You want to shoot at a small aperture, say f/16, and you want to focus 1/3 into the scene. Now, in most cases, this works. It starts to get tricky when you have an element close to the front element of your lens. Well, there's an app for that. It's called the Depth of Field Calculator, and this will help you calculate how to set your lens up for when you do have that near element to your lens. But again, you want to try to get everything in the scene in focus. So whether you shoot in the AV mode, the aperture priority mode, or the manual mode, you want to think about your aperture. In this scene that I took on the Oregon coast, look at the patterns in the sand in the bottom right-hand part of the picture. They're in sharp focus. Look at the birds in the background. They're in focus. That's again because I'm using the wide-angle lens, small aperture, and focusing 1/3 into the scene. When you're photographing panoramas, you also want to follow that same 3-step process. And again, the wider the lens, the better. So here I wanted a lot of depth of field. Later on in the class, I'm going to cover photographing panoramas. But for now, I just wanted to share this image with you to let you know that yes, Iceland is wonderful for seascapes, but it's also awesome for landscapes. The next basic concept I'd like to talk about is getting a good exposure. And getting good exposure starts with exposing for the highlights. You don't want the brightest part of the scene overexposed and washed out. If it is, no matter how good you are in Photoshop, if it's overexposed more than about a stop, it's going to be pretty hard to get those highlights back. So to get a good exposure, here's what I do. I'm always shooting with my highlight alert activated. I don't want to see any blinkies on the back of my camera. So if I do have blinkies, I'll underexpose a little bit until they go away. I also shoot with my histogram activated. I do not want to see, and you don't want to see, a spike on the right that indicates those highlights are overexposed and washed out. So exposing for the highlights is very, very important. I shoot most of my pictures on the AV mode, the aperture priority mode, and I have the metering set on my camera to the average metering mode. Now, with that setup, I don't really need, in a low contrast situation, too many EV adjustments, too many plus and minus adjustments. Those adjustments come in high contrast situations like here. So again, I'm shooting on the AV mode, I'm shooting on the average metering mode. Now, I know in a scene like this, the average metering mode, that bright sun, would be overexposed in this scene if I shot with no plus and minus adjustments, because all the dark area would fool the camera's meter into thinking the scene is darker than it is. So here I had to use a -2 exposure compensation setting. So if you learn how to see the light, you can use those plus and minus exposure compensation settings to fine-tune your image. Look at the detail around the sun. Look at those clouds. That's what I wanted to preserve in this image. So I underexposed until I had detail in those areas of the scene. Speaking of shooting into the sun, use live view. Protect your eyes. Even if you're wearing sunglasses and if you're looking through the viewfinder, that sun can be really bright. You can damage your eyes. So live view is great for saving your eyes. And guess what? If you haven't used it, I'm sure it will help you with your composition. Because I find on my workshops, when the photographers slow down, put their camera on a tripod, and use live view, they see different elements in the scene. So live view is great for protecting your eyes and for creative composition. Another basic concept is separation. Now, yes, separation has to do with composition, and I'm going to cover that later on in the online seminar. But I want to talk about it now because it's so very important. We see the world in three dimensions: height, width, and depth. Our cameras only see two: height and width. So, by creating that separation in our pictures, we can actually create a sense of depth. Let me show you some examples. Notice in this photograph how the elements are separated. The iceberg on the left is separated from the iceberg on the right, and both of those icebergs are separated from the icebergs in the background, and the rock in the foreground is separated. Check out this shot. From a composition standpoint, from a separation standpoint, this photograph is a mess. All the elements are jumbled together. So simply by moving around, by thinking about separation, by thinking about careful composition, I was able to turn this jumbled shot, with a little bit of processing too, into a much more creative image that has a lot of separation. Here's another example of a compositional mess. All the trees are going together. Here, the trees have some separation, and that's caused by the light. So light and shadows, that's another way to create a sense of separation in our photographs. Now, this is an HDR photograph. I'm going to cover HDR later on in the seminar, but for now, I took 4 photographs to create what I call my HDR negative. And HDR negatives look a little flat because you're opening up the shadows and toning down the highlights. So HDR negatives need a little bit of processing. They need a little boost in contrast, in saturation, and sharpness, and you can create an image like this that, in this case, has a sense of separation. The next basic concept I'd like to talk about is image enhancements. Every picture in this online seminar has been enhanced in some form or fashion. For example, raw files need sharpening. They come out of the camera a little bit soft. So even if you only sharpen a picture, you're enhancing that picture. So let's take a look at this shot. It's another HDR image. I captured the entire dynamic range of the scene by taking 5 exposures. In Photomatics, I created my HDR negative. I enhanced that HDR negative in Photoshop, and then I brought it into On1 Perfect Photo Suite, and I used the cool night effect in the enhance filter there, and I created a dreamy-like picture, and then I brought it back into Photoshop for a few more enhancements. So this is the image that I saw in my mind's eye. I visualized this image, and this is very, very important when it comes to our photography. We have to visualize the end result. We have to know what can we do in the digital darkroom to awaken that artist within. Here's another example. I'm in Bosque del Apache, New Mexico, got up super early to photograph a great sunrise. Well, the picture on the right is the straight shot. It wasn't a great sunrise. I used a gradual filter in the Color Effects Pro to enhance that picture. Here's another example of image enhancements. Late one afternoon, I'm photographing at the New Croton Dam, about 5 minutes from my house. I love the scene, I love the mist, but I didn't love the color. So I opened that image in Photoshop and I boosted the blues. Here we are again, back at the dam, picture on the left taken after sunset, but I made it a sunny day by boosting the yellows and the reds, by increasing the saturation and by increasing the contrast. I visualized the end result. Remember that Iceland landscape photograph that I showed you before? Well, this is how the scene looked. And after I enhanced it, this is how the scene looked. So I turned this shot into this shot simply by increasing the contrast, by boosting the saturation, by increasing the sharpness, by adding a gradual filter to the sky. And the last basic concept I want to tell you, yes, we could do all this stuff, but there's no substitute for good light. Both of these pictures were taken in Mono Lake from about the same location. What's the difference? It's the light. Black and white photography. When it comes to landscape and seascape photography, black and white rocks. Why? Because when we remove some of the reality from the scene by removing the color, our pictures can, but not always, look more creative and more artistic. That's why a lot of fine art photographers love to work in black and white. When you are working in black and white, contrast becomes very important because we're not enamored with the color. So light illuminates, shadows define. Shadows are the soul of the picture. So dramatic black and white pictures often have strong shadows and nice highlights. We get those beautiful shadows in the early morning and in the late afternoon. So when it comes to black and white landscape photography, you snooze, you lose. You have to get up early. You have to stay out late to capture those beautiful shadows. There are many different ways to create dramatic black and white images. You can do that in Lightroom. Click on one of the black and white presets over on the left and fine-tune your image over on the right. You can also create dramatic black and white and monochromatic images in plugins. This is a screenshot of black and white effects from Topaz Labs. I selected the presets on the left and then I fine-tuned the picture over there on the right. But notice, I have the red filter circled. Same thing here. I have the red filter circled. This is a screenshot from Nick Silver Effects Pro. Now, when I teach black and white photography, I strongly suggest playing around with the different filters. In landscape photography, seascape photography, my guess is you'll like the red filter and the orange filter. The blue filter, maybe not so much. But play around with those different filters to see how they affect the tones and the values and the contrast in the scene. You know, when I used to shoot black and white photography, and when Ansel Adams used to shoot black and white photography, we played around with filters. We experimented with filters to see how they would affect the image. So those filters are very, very important when it comes to black and white photography. This is one of my favorite black and white images from a trip I made up to Alaska. These are called grounded icebergs. Now, I like the color shot, but I thought the black and white shot had more drama. Notice how the shadows are pretty much blocked up in this scene. Notice, by the way, how everything in the scene is in focus, and we talked about that before, following that little formula. But anyway, the shadows are blocked up, and they're blocked up here. But I'm going to get back to that in just a minute. One of the cool things about black and white is this, that if you set out to shoot in black and white, after a while, and it does take a while, you will start to see in black and white. And you will look for values rather than colors. So you'll look for variations in the different tones and the values and the shades and the gradation in the photograph. And this is kind of cool. So shooting black and white will actually help you become a better photographer also. So let's get back to the shadows. As you can see in this photograph, the shadows are kind of blocked up. And in this photograph, they're even more blocked up. So I post this picture on Google Plus and someone says, Rick, are you kidding? You know how to use HDR. You know how to use Photoshop and Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. How come you didn't open up the shadows? Well, I said, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do it. Here, I thought the dark shadows added something to the scene, added a sense of drama to this beautiful scene. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks that way or thought that way. Ansel Adams, if you do a search on his wonderful photographs, you'll see that in some of his photographs, the shadows are indeed blocked up. So shadows really are the soul of the picture. So that's one thing to remember. And the other thing to remember is just because you think you can do something, it doesn't mean you necessarily want to do it. Another thing about black and white landscape photography, and actually all landscape photography in general, there are basically two types of pictures. One that shows the hand of man or the footprint of man as illustrated by the picture on the bottom, or a picture that does not show the hand of man as illustrated by the picture on the top left. So you want to ask yourself, what type of picture do I want to take? Do I want to take a picture that shows the hand of man, which would actually sell better on iStock because it's more of a lifestyle picture? Or do you want to create a fine art picture, a picture that does not show the hand of man? But no matter what type of black and white or color landscape photograph you want to make, remember this: light illuminates, shadows define. And indeed, shadows are the soul of the photograph. As a photographer, it's very important to learn how to see the light. Now, the light changes throughout the day, and of course, the weather conditions affect the light. So that's what we're going to talk about in this section, seeing the light. I took this picture at a place called Artist Palette in Death Valley a few minutes after sunset. Look at those gorgeous colors. I took this picture in Artist Palette in Death Valley a few minutes before sunset. Man, oh man, look at those boring colors. What's the main difference between this picture and this picture? That's right, it's the light. So it's all about the lights. We have to learn how to see the light and understand how the light affects the mood and the feeling of our picture. This picture is rather cold and not inviting because of the light, and this picture is warm and inviting because of the light. Just look at the beautiful light in this photograph. I took this photograph at Zabriskie Point, also in Death Valley, a few minutes before sunrise. It's very warm and inviting. A few minutes later, I took this picture after sunrise. It's very harsh and not that inviting. However, some people, when I show this in my presentation, prefer this picture over this picture. So that's one of the cool things actually about photography. It's all very subjective. So what I always say to my students, follow your heart. Let's talk about the different elements when it comes to learning how to see the light. Now, it would take an entire presentation actually to cover all these elements. And I actually have an entire presentation on light over on Kelby One. Just go to kelby1.com, check out Rick Sammon, and you'll see my presentation there. I also have a presentation there on composition. But this one is a very detailed class on light. But for now, let's quickly go over each one of these elements. First and foremost, we want to learn how to see the contrast range in the scene, the difference between the shadows and the highlights. In a very, very high contrast scene, we might need HDR. If the contrast is strong, we always want to expose for the highlights when we're not doing HDR. So you want to have that histogram on and you want to have the highlight alert activated. So learning how to see the contrast range of the scene is very important. Learning how to see the direction of light is also important. In landscape photography, side lighting, as illustrated in the top photograph, really creates dramatic pictures. In the bottom photograph, the light is coming from behind me. It looks kind of flat and kind of boring. So the direction of light is important. What about the color of light? Well, we talked about that briefly. Warm tones are warm and inviting. Cool tones can be inviting, but they create a different mood. So we have a warm tone image on the left and a cool tone picture on the right. And of course, we could change the tones in Lightroom and in Photoshop, and changing the tones, that's right, it changes the mood. What about the quality of light? Well, we have harsh light illustrated by the picture on the right, and we have soft light illustrated by the picture on the left. So we get soft light on overcast days and in the shade, and we get harsh light on sunny days. In harsh light, the contrast range increases, so we must keep our eye again on that highlight alert and on our histogram. When I talk about the intensity of light, I'm talking about the brightness range in the scene. We always want to shoot at the lowest possible ISO to get the cleanest possible shot. On a sunny day, you should be shooting at ISO 100 or ISO 200 to get that clean shot. As the light level decreases, you're going to have to boost up your ISO if you're not using a tripod. Now, a lot of people are afraid of boosting the ISO because they're afraid of getting noise or grain in their picture, grain as we used to call it. Well, my father had a great expression. If a picture is so boring that we notice the noise, it's a boring picture. You know, some photographers that have actually built a reputation on soft and grainy and actually slightly out of focus pictures. So it's all, again, it's all subjective. But learning how to see the intensity of light is very important. Seeing the movement of light is also important. And when I talk about seeing the movement of light, I'm talking about moving water in landscape photography or moving clouds. And if you're doing street photography, it's moving taillights and moving headlights of cars. So if we learn how to see the movement of light, and we're going to talk about blurring the water a little later on in the presentation, we can choose a slow shutter speed to create the effect that we want. So it makes sense. If we learn how to see the light, the contrast range in the scene, the direction of light, the color, the quality, the intensity, and the movement of light, we'll be able to get the very best in-camera exposure. And as a landscape photographer, this should be a main goal. Yes, we could process the image afterward, but we always want to get the very best in-camera exposure. We're coming up on the halfway point in the online seminar. I hope you're learning a lot, and I hope you're having a lot of fun. But you know what? I'd like to take a break from the tech talk and ask you a question. It's a very important question that you should ask yourself because it will help you fine-tune your photography. So the question is, what if? What if you've only got one shot? If you could only make one image? So when you start to think this way, you're not going to use what's called the spray and pray approach, what I call the shotgun approach, just shooting everywhere, hoping that you get something. You're going to use what I call the bow and arrow approach. You're going to be much more targeted when it comes to your composition, when it comes to your focus. For example, when I was in Iceland photographing these grounded icebergs, this is the one shot I wanted to get. I wanted to get a shot of the sun just peeking out from behind one of these beautiful icebergs. Same thing when I was in Holland. This is the one shot that I wanted to get. Let me give you another example. I'm in Death Valley, California, a place called Badwater, and I wanted to make one image that conveyed the heat and the starkness of this awesome location. But this is not how the scene looked. Before I show you how the scene looked, look at the upper right-hand corner. You'll notice some dust spots there. I could have taken them out very easily in Lightroom and in Photoshop, but I left them in there as a reminder. Always clean your image sensor. It'll save you time in your image making process. So let's take a look at the original image. This is the middle exposure of a bracketed HDR sequence. So I knew I needed HDR to capture the entire dynamic range of the scene. But still, even with my HDR image, the scene looked kind of cool, meaning cool in temperature, had a blue tone. So to warm up the scene, to create that sense of heat, I added a bicolor filter in Nik Color Effects Pro. So envisioning the end result helped me get the shot that I wanted to get, that one shot. So if you start to think this way, you'll start to shoot this way. And I promise you, it will help you improve your photography. Let's talk a little more about HDR photography, high dynamic range photography. When I teach HDR, the first thing I suggest is this. I tell the workshop participants, do a search. I hate HDR. You do a search, I hate HDR, you'll find hundreds of pages on why people hate HDR, and of course you shouldn't hate anything. But people don't like HDR in most cases because the images are overprocessed or overcooked. That means the images have too much contrast, or they're too flat, or the images are oversaturated, and of course the dreaded halos cause people to hate HDR. But if you know what you're doing in HDR, you can avoid all of those pitfalls. The second thing I do when I teach HDR is tell the students this. Yes, I love HDR. You know, I have an HDR book, I have an HDR app, but HDR can indeed ruin the mood of the scene. And as we've talked about, that's the most important element in a photograph. It's the mood, it's the feeling. Check out the picture on the left. It's a boring HDR shot. It really has no mood or feeling, and it was taken at the same time, or just about the same time. I took the two pictures on the right, the silhouette on the top and the painting with light photograph on the bottom. Those pictures have a mood. They have a feeling. Picture on the left, it's boring as heck. I just took it to illustrate that HDR is not always the way to go. Same thing here. We arrived at this beautiful location in Mount Rainier, Washington, late in the afternoon. I could have shot HDR, I could have opened up those shadows, but I thought those shadows added a sense of mystery to the scene, and that's the mood I wanted to create. However, HDR was the answer when I saw this beautiful scene in Iceland. The contrast range was just too great to be captured in a single image. So I set my Canon 5D Mark III on HDR, and I took a bracketed sequence at 0, +2, and -2. My in-camera HDR image was good, but to add to the mood of the scene, I applied the duplex filter in Nik Color Effects Pro. That softens the image. That gives it a painterly type look. My goal, of course, was to make an HDR image that did not look like an HDR image. This is one of my favorite HDR images from Antelope Canyon. It does not look like an HDR image. Here are two more images that don't look like HDR images. That's because they're not. The contrast range did not require HDR. So we have to learn how to see the light. In a high contrast range, we need HDR. So getting back to my favorite Antelope Canyon HDR image, the contrast range here required 4 images. I processed those 4 images in Photomatics to create my HDR image. Hey, if you don't have Photomatics, you can get a 15% discount on the program from my website. Just go to the Save on Plugins page. Oh, and here's a bonus tip. Don't wear shorts. Enough said. I like color HDR images, but I also like to create black and white HDR images, and I think you'll like that too. And when you think about it, Ansel Adams was the first HDR photographer. He created HDR images in the wet darkroom. Today we do that effortlessly almost in the digital darkroom. This is one of my favorite black and white HDR images. I created it from a 3-shot sequence that I took with my Canon G10, little point-and-shoot camera. The key, as always, was to get an underexposed image that showed none of the highlights overexposed and washed out. That's the middle image. And an image that showed detail in the shadow areas. That's the image on the right. And the average exposure is over on the left. After I created my HDR image, I converted my color file to black and white in Lightroom. As you can see, we have detail in the highlights, the clouds, and we can see into the shadows. I think it's a pretty good HDR image. Getting back to in-camera HDR can work very well if the contrast range in the scene is not more than about 5 f-stops. This is one of my favorite in-camera HDR images from Iceland, and here is another. For both images, I chose the Art Vivid mode, which is just one option when you're choosing HDR with the Canon 5D Mark III. So yes, HDR can work wonders, but always remember, there's no substitute for good light. I like the straight shot on the left. It was taken on an overcast day when the contrast range was relatively low. I don't like the HDR shots on the right. I think the shadows running through the frames looks kinda weird. I just included them here to illustrate that, again, HDR is not always the answer. Lenses. Let's talk about lenses. But you know, when you think about it, a lens is more than just a piece of glass. It's a device that helps you tell your own individual story. And that's one of the cool things, again, about being a photographer. We can all tell our own story in our own different ways. So let's take a look at some of my favorite lenses and how they help me tell a story and how they might help you tell your story. I photographed this beautiful scene in the Conway Valley with my 17 to 40 millimeter lens at the 17 millimeter setting. This lens is my #1 lens for landscape photography. Whenever I'm photographing, I'm always looking for pictures within pictures. I'm always looking for that telephoto view. So I switched to my 70 to 200 millimeter lens and got this close-up shot of this S-curve. With those two photographs, I was able to tell my story of this beautiful scene in the Conway Valley. You know, a lot of people don't think about using a telephoto lens for landscape photography, but a telephoto zoom lens is great for landscape photography for two reasons. One, it compresses the elements in the scene, and when those elements are compressed, some of the reality is removed from the scene. Now, a telephoto lens also cuts the clutter. You know, in landscape photography, that's one of the things we want to do. We just don't want to photograph, a big wide open space. We want to have a subject. So these telephoto lenses help us cut the clutter. They're really cool. So don't leave home without your wide angle zoom and your telephoto zoom. Here's another example of storytelling with two lenses. I'm in this beautiful glacial lagoon in Alaska. I took this shot with my 15 millimeter lens, and then as we got a little closer, I switched to my 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Again, both pictures help me tell my story of this awesome experience. When I set out to shoot landscapes, I never leave home without my 24 to 105 millimeter image stabilization lens. In fact, I never leave home without it. It's my favorite lens. I photographed this scene with that lens from a small plane in Alaska. Fisheye lenses are also great storytelling lenses, and they can help us tell a fun story. Here I'm in Antarctica photographing with my 15 millimeter lens, and here I'm in Peru photographing with that same lens. Now, when you're using this lens, remember this. The more you tilt the lens down towards your toes, the more the horizon line will be curved. So in Machu Picchu, I'm photographing straight out, but when I was in Antarctica, I'm tilting that lens down almost to my toes because I wanted that curvature of the horizon line. And a quick tip here, make sure that your toes and the legs of your tripod are not in your frame because a 15 millimeter lens has a very wide view. As you can see, having a variety of lenses helps us tell a story. But what happens if you only have one lens? What happens if you only want to use one lens? Well, that's exactly what I did up in Iceland. I'm in this beautiful glacial lagoon, and I only wanted to take one lens with me, my Canon 24 to 105 millimeter image stabilization lens. Here's why. Number one, it was raining. I was getting soaked, but I didn't want a lot of camera gear to get soaked. Number two, we were not going to be there for that long. I wanted mobility. I wanted the ability to move around. I wanted the ability to shoot and scoot. I didn't want to be weighed down, especially when I was walking through the water with the camera bag. And number three, I actually thought I could tell the story with one lens, that 24 to 105 millimeter lens. At the 24 millimeter setting, I was able to get beautiful horizontal shots and beautiful vertical shots. At the 105 millimeter setting, I was able to zoom in and capture the beautiful details in the ice. And at the close-up setting, that's right, I was able to get cool close-ups. And speaking of cool, this piece of ice looks pretty much like a seahorse, to me anyway. Well, a quick composition tip. If you find something that looks interesting, move around it. This is how the piece of ice looked from one angle, moving just a little, revealed to me anyway the seahorse. So move around the subject. You might be surprised what you see. Now, check out this shot. This was taken with the same lens. It's an 8-shot panorama. So with that one lens, I think I was able to tell the story of this beautiful, beautiful glacial lagoon. In closing out this section on lenses, I thought I'd talk about fast lenses, lenses with wide apertures. Now, fast lenses are heavy because they have a lot of glass and they're expensive. I don't own fast lenses. I borrow lenses through the Canon Professional Services, and if you're not a member of CPS, you can borrow lenses through borrowlenses.com. So, fast lenses have two main benefits. Number one, they let you shoot at a lower ISO than you can with a slower lens, so you get a cleaner shot with less noise in it. Fast lenses also let you shoot at a faster shutter speed. So if you're photographing a scene like this in Iceland where the ice is moving, it's moving slowly, but it's still moving, you can shoot at a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. So fast lenses are great if you're shooting in low light. And of course, you want to use a tripod. And if you're shooting at a slow shutter speed, you're going to want to use a cable release, your self-timer, or an app. Of course, this image is enhanced. You see that up on the top left. The original is down on the bottom. I'm going to talk about those enhancements later on in the online seminar. When it comes to shooting close-ups, you could use everything from a 15mm super wide-angle lens to a 50mm or a 60mm or a 100mm macro lens. Now, macro lenses give you one-to-one reproduction. That little flower setting on your zoom lens, that is not a macro lens setting. That's a close-up setting. When you set your lens to that setting, you'll get as close as possible to the subject. But again, if you want a true macro picture, you'll want to get a true macro lens. But basically, you could use a lot of different lenses for close-up photography. Here's an example. I took this picture on my Oregon Coast photo caravan with my 24 to 105mm image stabilization lens. But here's a quick tip. This picture looks very flat because I'm photographing flat on. Look what happens when I move over to the side. The picture has a greater sense of depth and dimension. So we have to remember as a photographer that we see the world in 3 dimensions. Our cameras see 2. So we have to create that sense of depth. We can do that with shadows, we could do that with lighting, but we could also do it by shooting at an angle. And that's exactly what I did here. In our close-up photography, and actually in all our photography, depth of field is very, very important. But in close-up photography, depth of field is important because we're shooting close to the subject. And as you move close to the subject, depth of field is reduced. So for good depth of field, I recommend shooting at f11, f16, f22. If you don't want a lot of depth of field, go the other way. Shoot at 4.5, 5.6, or even wider. But always check your depth of field. I'm always checking the depth of field with the depth of field preview button on my camera, and I'm also zooming in on different areas of the scene to make sure they're in focus. And I recommend that you do the same thing. Another thing to think about in close-up photography is that we need to cut the clutter. We have to remember that photography is subtractive. We want to subtract elements from the scene to tell our story, whereas painting is additive. A painter adds elements to the scene. So this picture is basically a mess. I took it with my 50mm macro lens. This picture is a little bit better, and this picture is much better. However, look up at the top left. That's very distracting. When we look at a picture, our eye usually goes to the brightest part of the scene first. So I always use what's called border patrol, and I crop out or I clone out after the fact elements that I don't want in the photograph. So I crop that out, I darken the edges, and I created the image that I wanted. So this picture has much more impact than that very cluttered picture that we started with. Right now, I'd like to take a very, very short break from all this tech talk to talk about something very, very important for all landscape and seascape photographers. And that is staying in shape. We have to stay in shape. We have to exercise. We have to eat right. Why? Well, here's why. When we see a scene like this, where the light is changing by the minute, maybe the half minute, we want to be able to run around. We want to be able to set up our tripod as fast as possible so we can A, tell the story, and B, get as many different shots as we want. We do not want to miss that light. And if we're in good shape, we could run around in this situation, climbing around the rocks, capturing the light. So stay in shape, exercise, and eat right. Getting back to talking technical, the next section is about blurring water, but that's the short title. The long title is Blurring Water and Photographing Waterfalls, Long Exposures, and ND Filters. That ND filter is your most important accessory when it comes to photographing moving water. It reduces the amount of light entering your lens so you can shoot at a slow shutter speed. And that's how we get that blurred effect, by shooting at a slow shutter speed. So an ND filter is a must. When you are shooting at slow shutter speeds, you want to have your camera mounted on a tripod, a sturdy tripod, and to avoid camera shake, you want to use a self-timer or some kind of remote release, a cable release or an app. So people ask me all the time, Rick, what's the best shutter speed to use when it comes to photographing moving water? Well, the answer to every question anyone ever asks me on a workshop is, it depends. I suggest experimenting with different exposures from a fifth of a second to several seconds. Again, you have to use a tripod and a cable release or an app or a self-timer. I suggest using a camera cover to keep the moisture off your camera and your lens, and keep a lens cleaning cloth with you at all time. A tiny droplet of water on your lens can look like a big blob in your picture. So in photographing waterfalls, the shutter speed you choose depends on the speed of the water, how close you are to the water, the lens you are using, and the desired effect. So experiment and, of course, have fun. And one more photo tip. I'm going to be quiet for just a minute here. Enjoy the moment. Waterfalls are so beautiful. So yes, take your shot, work hard, but enjoy the moment. Okay, enough about relaxing and enjoying the moment. Back to work. Let's talk about panoramas. Panoramas are a wonderful way, and sometimes the best way, to capture a sweeping landscape or seascape. When I was standing on a cliff in Bryce Canyon, I felt as though a pano was the best way to go. I wanted to get as much of the canyon in the scene as possible. This is a 7-shot pano. I took 7 images to create this one panorama image. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a little bit. But there's no rule about how many images you need for a pano. It could be as little as 2. It could be as many as 12 or even more. It depends. And you know what I say about depends. It depends on the lens you are using and how much of the scene you want to capture. Here is another 7-shot pano. Before I get into the basics of making panos, here's a quick composition tip. Look for an S-curve in landscapes and seascapes, or as you see here on the left and on the right, a double S-curve. This was an awesome location in Iceland. By the way, perhaps the best-known landscape photographer of all times, Ansel Adams, made the S-curve popular for photographers in his wonderful photograph, The Tetons and the Snake River. I just love this photograph and how that river snakes through the photograph. Pano basics. Let's take a look at the basics you need to know when making your panos. Don't use a polarizing filter. It can cause dark bands in the sky. Set your exposure to manual so the exposure does not change throughout your pano sequence. Set your white balance to the scene so the colors do not change throughout your pano. Hold your camera vertically. Keep the horizon line level. When you're panning to create your pano, overlap your images by about a third. When composing, leave room at the top, bottom, left, and right of your sequence, because some of those areas will be cropped out when your pano is stitched together. That said, you might be able to add them back with Photoshop's Content-Aware Fill feature. Follow these tips and you should get a seamless panorama, one that captures the beauty of the scene. All of the panoramas you see here are handheld panoramas. Now, I take a lot of panos and I have a lot of practice, so hand-holding works fine for me. To increase your chances of getting a perfect pano, you can use a special panorama head. Panorama heads are a little expensive. Actually, they're more than a little expensive. They can cost up to $700, but they work very, very well. Really right stuff? These guys make the best ones I've seen. But again, all the panos here are handheld. This is actually a handheld panel selfie. And this screen grab from Adobe Bridge shows my original images. As you can see, I left plenty of room at the top, bottom, left, and right of the scene, so when I cropped my image, I had the pano I envisioned. Let's take a moment to compare some straight shots to some panorama images of the same scene. Here's a shot I took at Dead Horse Point State Park with my 17 to 40 millimeter lens set at the 17 millimeter setting. Here's a 5-shot pano. I like this one better because it captures much more of the scene. I took this shot in Bryce Canyon with my 17 to 40 millimeter lens at the 17 millimeter setting, and yes, it captures the beautiful view. But I think this pano, to me anyway, is more breathtaking. You know, you can also make panorama-like images with just a bit of creative cropping. This image, which looks like a pano, is not a pano. It's actually a cropped version from a full frame shot. I took this picture with my Canon 24 to 105 millimeter image stabilization lens at the 105 millimeter setting. I zoomed in knowing that I would crop out the top and the bottom. So this is the picture I envisioned in my mind's eye. Just like all of the images you see here are handheld panos, all of the panoramas you've seen here were stitched together in Photoshop's Photo Merge. And in most cases it works great. However, if your images don't line up and when you want to fine-tune individual frames, a program called PTGui can help big time. Yes, it's a little expensive, but it's perhaps the best panel making program available. Give it a try with a free trial. Just go to www.ptgui.com. And one final thought on panorama images. Yes, they can look great, but don't forget that vertical images can have impact too. And you know what? In some cases, they can have even more impact than horizontal or panorama images. So what do I say? Well, my advice is this: shoot it both ways. Well, believe it or not, this is slide number 200 in the seminar. I hope you're still having fun, and I hope, of course, you're still learning a lot. Let's talk briefly about composition. I say briefly because I have several YouTube videos that cover composition, which you can see on my YouTube channel and which you can get to through my website, www.ricksammon.com. I also have an iPhone and iPad app, Conquer Composition, which covers all the basics. Here are some important points to remember when it comes to composition. Famed photographer Edward Weston really summed it up. He said, "Composition is the strongest way of seeing." And I agree. You see, when we set out to look for photographs, we'll see them. Here's an example. This geyser in Iceland is a very famous tourist spot. Tourists go there to see and photograph the geyser. They look at the scene. When my Iceland Photo Workshop participants stopped at this location, I reminded them of the power of seeing photographs, as opposed to just looking at a pretty scene. Most of them saw the beautiful lenticular clouds in the background, and they made some of the most awesome pictures of clouds I've ever seen. Here's one of my favorites, and here is another. As an aside, because the scene was monochromatic, I decided to experiment with black and white conversions. I made this black and white image in Nik Silver Efex Pro. Getting back to this image, notice how some of the icebergs in this photograph are separated. When I teach composition, I stress that one of the most important elements in composition is separation. We need to separate the subjects in a scene to give the photograph a sense of depth. When the subjects are all jumbled together, a picture looks and falls flat. Here's another example of separation. I composed the scene with separation in mind. And the same thing here. The iceberg in the background is separated from the iceberg in the foreground. For now, let's go over some other basic composition concepts. Using a foreground element is important. It creates a sense of depth in an image. Notice how the foreground elements in this scene and in this scene create a sense of depth. Another idea? Try composing a scene with an imaginary tic-tac-toe grid over the frame and place the main subject where the lines intersect. In this photograph, it's in the upper left-hand part of the photograph. Contours. Contours make for nice compositions. They create a peaceful and relaxed feeling. Leading lines are cool too. Leading lines lead the viewer into the scene. This is not exactly a leading line, but you are led through the scene by following the stream, which is exactly why I photographed the scene at an angle. Movement. When I talk about movement, I am talking about you moving around. This is a nice shot, right? But just by moving a little bit over to the right, I got a much more dramatic image. So move around. Placement of the horizon line is also important when it comes to composition. If the foreground is interesting, place it at the top of the frame. When the foreground is boring, place it at the bottom of the frame. And here's a composition technique that you may not have heard about, unless you listen to my Digital Photo Experience podcast. Use your camera like a spaceship. Move it up, move it down, move it all around, and look for different angles. From one angle, this rock formation looks gigantic, but from another, you can see that it's only a few feet high. Of course, we can combine composition techniques for creative images. Here I combined using a foreground element, getting down low, and using my camera like a spaceship, filling the frame, getting everything in the scene in focus, and careful cropping. Cropping, one of my favorite topics. Here's how I sum up cropping. Crop my pictures and you're a dead man. That's what I say to my publishers, tongue-in-cheek of course, when it comes to cropping my images. You see, I spend a lot of time composing and cropping my images. I don't want anyone to touch them. And I think you should feel the same way, because cropping, among other things, can change the message of an image. I'll start the filter section with a bad photograph because it illustrates how important it is to keep your filters and the front element of your lens clean. For this shot, the lens was very dusty. All those dust spots look like big blobs in the photograph, so keep it clean when it comes to filters and lenses. Clean filters are especially important when shooting into the sun. When I took the shot, my filter was very clean, so I could say, "Hey, look, Ma, no blobs caused by dust spots." I only use two filters on my lenses, a polarizing filter to reduce glare on the water and ice, and by the way, a polarizing filter is most effective when the sun is at a 90-degree angle to your lens. The other filter I always have with me is an ND filter, so I can shoot at slow shutter speeds to blur the water. When it comes to ND filters, there are two types, fixed and variable. If you are serious about your waterfall photography, you probably want to get a set of fixed ND filters. Variable ND filters work well in most cases. However, when shooting at wide-angle lens settings and when the sun is at a strong angle, you can get a dark band in your image with that variable ND filter. And that band is virtually impossible to eliminate in Photoshop or Lightroom because it's so gradual. Well, we're coming down the home stretch of the seminar. Just a few minutes left. You know, we can't end the seminar without talking about photographing sunrises and sunsets. So here's a few quick tips. For sunrises, you want to arrive well before sunrise, often in the dark. If you get a head-mounted flashlight, you'll be able to set up your gear without having to hold a flashlight. It makes setting up your gear a lot easier. Exposure-wise, as we have talked about, always expose for the highlights. Have your histogram on and have your highlight alert activated. The best time for photographing sunrises is often before sunrise, when you get those beautiful colors in the sky. After sunrise, the color is gone and the contrast range is often too great for a single photograph. Too great, that is, unless you shoot HDR. So don't forget, you can shoot HDR at sunrises and sunsets. This is not an HDR shot, it's a straight shot taken before sunrise, and this photograph was also taken before sunrise. Look at that beautiful light. This is why you want to shoot before the sun comes up. At sunset, strong light can produce strong, harsh shadows. After the sunsets, don't be in a hurry to pack up. I took this photograph a few minutes after sunset. Here again, the light is very harsh. It's not that flattering to the subjects. Here, the light is soft and flattering to the subjects. I just love the beautiful warm tones and colors in this scene. As you have seen in this seminar, it's often all about the light. I took both of these photographs at sunrise, just a few minutes apart. The only difference was the direction in which I pointed my camera. So as I said early on in the seminar, we need to look for the light. If we don't have good light, we can create good light to a degree in Photoshop and Lightroom using some basic image enhancements. For the picture you see on the left, which I created from the picture on the right, I cropped my image. And then I increased the exposure and boosted the saturation. As a final step, I reduced the noise in the photograph with Topaz Denoise, the plugin that I recommend for reducing noise in an image. The idea here, again as we have talked about, always envision the end result. We're just about finished. Right now, I'm reflecting on the class and how much fun I enjoyed putting it together for you. And speaking of reflecting, or rather reflections, you'll get the very best reflections on calm days when there's no wind. So it's very important to check the weather before you set out to take reflections. When it comes to composition, usually placing the horizon line in the center of the frame is a no-no. But it works beautifully when it comes to reflections. It had to happen. Now it's time to say goodbye. I really want to wish you good luck making your pictures. And remember, there's a big difference between taking a picture and making a picture. I know you are going to work very hard making pictures, but don't forget, just stop every once in a while, take a deep breath, and enjoy the moment. In closing, I want to say thank you. Actually, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for spending the past hour or so with me. Again, I hope you learned a lot and I hope you had a lot of fun. Remember, you are a student for life. Don't be shy. Don't be bashful. Email me questions. I'm here to help. Again, thank you so much for joining me. I'm Rick Sammon. I'll catch you later.